Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting 401 Access Denied podcast. This topic today is going to be very exciting. And I'm back again, your host, Joseph Carson, joining in from Tallinn, Estonia, where it's quite hot and steamy in the country at the moment. The temperature never lets us down. But I'm really excited. This is going to be a fun conversation. We've got a special guest on today to talk about a very, very hot topic that's on pretty much everyone's minds, not just in the US, but globally. And also with me today again is Mike. Mike, do you want to give us an introduction?
Yep, Mike Ruin, co-host, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary in lovely DC, which very tightly coupled to the topic today. And Dan Lohrmann is also joining us. I'll let him introduce himself.
It's great to be with you guys. Thanks so much, Mike and Joseph. I'm Dan Lohrmann. I'm the CSO and Chief Security Officer and Chief Strategist and Security Mentor. I have over 30 years in the security industry. So I actually started at the National Security Agency in Washington in the mid-'80s and worked in England with Lockheed and Mantech in the 90s, and then joined Michigan government for 17 years. So I had a lot of different roles in Michigan, agency CIO. Then after 9/11, I became the state's first CISO in all 50 state governments. Basically did that job for about 7 years. Then became CTO in Michigan. So all the CXO roles, guys. CTO over bringing all the data centers together, a lot of consolidations. And then Governor Rick Snyder came in. We actually created a CSO role. So went from dropped the I and brought physical and cybersecurity together. And Homeland Security, when DHS did that in Washington, they actually modeled it after what we did in Michigan. So we actually brought together physical and cybersecurity. So all the cameras, all the badges, all the physical security in the buildings under one roof. And I ran that for over 3 years before I joined Security Mentor. So we're involved in security awareness training. I do a lot of, I blog for CSO Magazine and also Government Technology Magazine. You can follow me on Lohrmann on cybersecurity. At GovCSO is my Twitter handle, and really talk about really everything related to really government security, but obviously that plays in the private sector because you got a lot of private sector companies supporting government, right? So, but yeah, glad to be with you guys today.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome.
It's great to have you on, and definitely, we've had some very interesting conversations over the past and always exciting discussions. And today is none other than the kind of interesting and hot topic of the time, which is election hacking. It's really all about, upcoming elections and presidential. And you've got a lot, we've had a lot of experiences in the past, and really kind of get into is what have we learned from the past? Has anything changed? Are we getting better? What types of things should we be concerned about? Especially given the pandemic and COVID-19 also does have play into the ability for people to vote not only securely but also safely from that perspective. So a lot of interesting things coming, and it's really interesting. I will say that when I think about, sometimes we get overemphasized. Even when we go to Black Hat and DEF CON and the conferences, and we also have the hacking election village that's there. And I also get it interesting that we sometimes tend to focus on just one aspect of election voting, is the infrastructure, is the time you push the button on the machine to when it gets counted. And that's sometimes what we tend to focus on. But in my experience, when I look at election hacking, it's the overall process end to end. It's the service. And sometimes we we don't look at the end-to-end service of it entirely. And we get overly involved, overly excited into the machines and into the firmware and into, getting physical access. But I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, look at how it all connects together. And also, I think one thing that's also mistaken and not made transparent enough is the transparency over the security measures of each different method. From whether you're going to, vote on paper, or whether you're using a mobile device, whether you're using internet voting, as we do in Estonia, or whether you're using, electronic voting, when you going to a voting booth, is important to really reveal what's the security differences between those. Make it transparent, make people more aware which one, they might not care about the security, they just want to get the vote. And others might be more conservative, more worried about security, and therefore might choose a more secure method, but only if they knew which one was the right one that they would choose. So getting into to Dan, when you hear about, election hacking and some of the experiences and the lessons learned and the reports that's revealed in the past, what keeps you up? What worries you about, the voting system itself, and which things do you think should people be really thinking about?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with your point, Joseph, about people, process, technology. It's the end to end. It is the process. It is, I think we learned a ton over the last 4 years. When you think about, I started blogging about election security literally like before actually said, could the election be hacked 9 months before the 2016 election? Everyone was laughing at me, literally. I mean, I got mocked by a lot of hackers and a lot of people saying, you're fringe, you're idiot, you're this, you're that. The election could never be hacked. And this was like January of 16, before the 16 election, and then all the way through after what happened afterwards, and literally all the different Russian involvement, all the different stories really for the last 4 years. So been covering this for 5 years now, and I totally agree with you that, it's much broader than the machine itself or the, counting ballots, especially now. And I think the thing keeping me up at night right now is, and we'll talk about it again, not taking any talking points one side or the other, but the mail-in voting, and especially, the process. I worry zero about mail-in voting for the states that have been doing it for a while. I worry the number one thing I would say, starting right off, and back up and talk about a number of different things, but the states that have made the changes like literally in a matter of months, and they they've come up with these processes, these secure processes. I think it was a pretty good process. I mean, but the reality is that a number of states, and I'm not talking about the states that have had mail-in voting forever, states that have been all mail-in voting, which was a number of states have been, we can start naming them, but states that are making the changes kind of like since June, or since, they decided to redo this, under COVID. That concerns me probably the most. I also think, go ahead.
I was going to ask, what about like the registration system? Because I think we focus a lot on voting, but the fact is, if you can hack earlier, the other part of the process, you can invalidate an ton of votes just with the registration system.
Absolutely. And so that was always the number one thing. I totally agree, Mike. That was the number one thing with when we first, I'm talking 4 years ago, hack the voter files, I work a lot in Michigan. We worked a lot with the Secretary of State there. I would say right now, I'm not formally working for any state government now. So actually, that's why I could talk to you guys. If I was, I wouldn't be able to do it. But I know a lot of people that are. I talk to them literally every week. I know what's hot and what's not. And done a lot of blogging and writing about this. And we'll talk about that maybe at the end. But, people get detailed comments I've written on this. But, can almost go state by state. But I agree, the voter files, the names, if you can, delete people, if you can get in there. And there's been documented interference in 16, 18, early 2020 about those, people trying to go after those voter files. There's examples of that. We can walk through those, trying to access and change names, delete names, add names, whatever. And then also the other thing we haven't mentioned real quickly, Joe, I just mentioned this, is really the fake news issue. If you can,
disinformation.
If you can go after, if you can, change even COVID conditions. If somebody, fully expect, what would you do if you were trying to disrupt an election, make it so people couldn't vote, didn't vote, lack trust in the vote, in the process, any kind of news, pile on, maybe there is a real story, pile on bad news, pile on good news. You can influence things, influence behaviors. That's a big part of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's some things that even I've seen over, in my entire career, what I've seen is the biggest challenge that many kind of from a political standpoint and election standpoint is voter suppression. Is how to redraw. So even in the old times, before, electronic and, electronic machines and stuff for voting, what way you could do it is basically redrawing county and border lines was to move people, shift them around. And that basically changed a lot of the outcomes of a lot of elections.
Yeah, Maryland is one of the worst gerrymandered states in the country, and that's where I live. It happens to be gerrymandered, in a particular way, but not that, very differently than other states are gerrymandered, but it's one of the worst. And you see that, the whole stacking and packing and that aspect of it as well. Although I feel like that's fringe, that's gray area hacking, right? That's where the government has. There's a process there, right? It's not in some outside individual doing it and having that influence. But yeah, you're
right. At least it's transparent. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, you can argue with it. Like, 49-51 vote in the House or the Senate on almost any issue. You're going to have two sides to an issue. The gerrymandering, we have a lot of that in Michigan, by the way, as well. I totally agree with you. But at least, in theory, at least, I'm sure there's some backroom deals. It's in the public domain. You can see the votes. You can see.
You can even challenge it.
Yeah,
you can even challenge the gerrymandering, or at least try to. One of the things.
I agree, Dan, on that side as well. One of the things I think, though, is that on voter suppression, though, is what we look at today in the electronic side of things is preventing people from registering to vote on time. Is the DDoS types of attacks. But when we think about one of the things that sometimes when we look at is the let's say cyber criminal, the hacking techniques. The most common thing is that they want to be stealthy. They don't want to be detected. They want to be as quiet as possible. So what I think the biggest challenge right now, and it's something we've all touched upon, is the confidence in the system itself. Is that if people have no confidence in the outcome, they won't vote. And I think ultimately that's the biggest thing is if you have lack of confidence and there's so much disinformation out there, you have so much ability and so much challenges even to get registered, then people basically will take the other option and say, we'll take whatever comes to us because we won't have an impact on the outcome.
Right.
I would agree. I mean, I would just add to that, I think, it's interesting just to understand, I say more recently, and I don't know how many of the listeners have, kind of know the history here and know kind of, there's some people do understand. There have been so many committees on this. There's money being thrown at it. People think there should be more money thrown at it, but there's a lot of money going into election security. We've been talking about it for 4 years. There has been a lot more security. Homeland Security has gotten involved. The FBI has gotten involved, protecting those databases. A lot has been done. Okay, so on the positive side, and we could say a lot of negatives, and believe me, I could shoot holes in this hole. But if you want to kind of lift, again, this is not Republican, Democratic. This is not. I'm not trying to. I'm being bipartisan here, trying to be, or nonpartisan, and just say we want a result that we can trust and we can verify. A lot of states, had, at the very basic level, a lot of states had electronic machines where there was no paper backup. You had no way of going back and verifying. I mean, all the states have pretty much gone. They have a paper. In theory, process is they on paper. They've got it on paper. They can see, what was your vote. They've made a lot of other changes to protect databases. There's a lot of good that has happened, even coming into COVID. Now, I think why I say mail-in voting, and I'm not, that may sound like a Trump talking point. I'm not trying to. It's not. I really the concern that I have is change. Any change that people are making in the final, like anything else, it's kind of like changing the rules of a football game. NFL does this every year. Changing the rules off season, fine. You hope they don't change the rules of the baseball game or the football game, or say, we're going to go with 5 strikes today, not 3 strikes, because somebody had an idea between games last night to today. That's not what you want. You want consistency. You want to say, these are the rules. We're all going to play by it, and we're going to go with it. And I think the challenge is I'm seeing a lot of states right now making a lot of changes that seem kind of ad hoc. I think, we'll see a year from now, we'll come back and listen to this recording and see who was right and who was wrong. I think the concerns, I'm hoping it's clear and we don't have days and maybe even weeks before we know who the winner is. I think that would be disconcerting to everybody. Yeah. I also think, the challenge is going to be, what is that process? And the answer is yes, because it's different in every state.
That's what I was going to ask about so it's different across states. And you see some states have had mail-in, as you said, they've had this for a long time. You've been there. What's the cooperation look like between states so that like me and Maryland, like the fact of the matter is, if I was going to hack the U.S. election, tell me I'm wrong, but my impression is I probably only have to target a handful of counties. Yeah, I don't need to hack across the entire country. There's a handful of counties in swing states that I would focus in on. And if I could get those, then I could probably get those states. And then it's just a whole thing, a domino effect. So how do Maryland know that there's confidence? How do I get confidence that states that are following best practices and cooperation, is that actually happening?
I think there is cooperation. I mean, I generally tend to be an optimist, guys, and I do think there's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of attention being done. It is a political football on both sides right now. But again, taking the Democrat Republican talking points out of this thing, I do think there's a lot of attention. I mean, in state government terms, I will tell you, I'm seeing this. We were talking about this in 2019 throughout the year before COVID. It's like election security was the pixie dust for everything. Not getting funding, election security. Oh, okay. Here's the cash. Go to room 3, right? We got money down there. Literally, the states, because of what happened in 2016, there's been a lot of attention on it. I agree with you 100%. You would just focus on certain counties. I do think there's been a lot of cooperation. I think the big change recently is, mail-in ballots. I mean, I've asked, and I'm not going to name states because I'm going to get in trouble if I do that. But, states that how do you get your mail-in ballot in? I think some states are still figuring out, can you drop it off? Can you put it in the mail? Is it by some states, it's, you have to have it in there by the time the polls close, which just think about that.
So I'm curious though on that, because I feel like almost every state has had absentee ballot, and that's a mail-in ballot, isn't it?
Yep.
So wouldn't it just be a matter of sort of expanding that program a little bit, or making it easier to get that absentee ballot, and then they already have the systems in place? It's not like some huge significant change.
So in theory, you're right. But what happened,
I love right in theory.
In theory, you're right. But what's happened is some states have been all mail-in ballot states, and that's all they've done, and that's great. I mean, they've been doing this for years.
Right.
Other states have changed the rules this year because of COVID and said, well, now we're going to mail out ballots to everybody, or we're going to mail out letters to everybody offering them a ballot.
I see.
And again, just because something was done well in Oregon or Washington State or somewhere else doesn't mean that it's been done in Florida before. And again, or that's been done, maybe it's, I don't know, 1% of the vote or 2% of the vote, and they're now projecting that it's going to be 50 or 60 or 80% of the vote. So it's not, just think about that. Just think about, your local help desk, think about your local, whatever it is, anything you do in business, in technology or not. And you're going to have 40 times, 50 times, 20 times the number.
I mean, that was the whole bending the curve with COVID-19, right? It wasn't that our health, it was just that we didn't want to not just, but one of the main things is that we don't want to overwhelm our healthcare system. It'll collapse. If everybody gets sick at the same time, everybody shows up at the hospital at the same time, that system won't be able to handle it. And what you're saying is basically the same is true for voting. If you had a mail-in voting system that was able to handle 20, 2%, 3%, whatever, now it's got to handle 30, 40, 50%, it's going to be overwhelmed. Is that?
Yes, correct. And I just, one other quick thing I'll let you get in here, Joseph, is,
right.
And I think every state, has integrity in this sense. They come up with, if we talk about people, process, and technology in the beginning of this, but you say, okay, if Dan Lohrmann votes, okay, how do you know if I mailed it in that and you didn't also show up at the poll and vote twice? Mm-hmm. How do you know you didn't make copy? I mean, they're very simple. You come up, and we just sat here, we come up with 20 different ways you could, defraud the system. So the checks need to be in place, and the states are putting in those checks. So they're doing a good job of saying, okay, here's how we know if we get here's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. If Dan votes in person and we get a mail-in ballot and which you won't happen with me, I'm going to go in person. But I would just say the reality is, how do we know that that's being followed? How do we know? So now we're down to auditing. We're down to, okay, the rules are this, 3 strikes. Well, why did you give Bill 5 strikes? I mean, how do you know that it's back to the process thing. Mm-hmm. Joseph mentioned that in the beginning. Even when you have a process, what's the level of confidence that process is being followed across the board in those key counties that you mentioned, Mike?
Right. And so I am right that it would be just, that was the scary part, is that I'm thinking about that, but I wasn't sure. I've never actually verified with someone who would know that, but that is the case, that there's just a handful of districts in purple states across the board that would need to be targeted.
Well, in theory, that's right. I mean, I think there's going to be, if you look at what happened, again, I have this blog that I wrote for Government Technology Magazine. You can go out and read it. It's a pretty long blog. It's like one of my longer ones, almost 3,000 words. So how election security has become a top issue. And it kind of just, it kind of gives you the history of all the different organizations in the national, the state legislatures, the auditor generals, the secretary of state offices, the governors, all the different things being done. The National Governors Association has been involved in this. There's so many organizations that have committees around election security. I mean, it's probably well over 100 committees on election security, which is a little bit concerning in and of itself.
Well, right, exactly. If you want to solve a problem, you definitely want to throw more people at it. The more people, definitely, the better everything will be, which is facetious.
Going back to one of the things that you mentioned as well is that, I'm very familiar with the Estonian system here, of the voting system that's been done here. And nothing's perfect. It's all about making sure that the goal, the focus that the Estonian government took was actually they see themselves as being a service provider to the citizens. So their intention is to get as many people to vote as possible. Yeah. Now, going back to one of the points that you made as well is about you could vote multiple times, different methods. And the same is possible in Estonia. I can go and vote on my phone multiple times, but it's only counted once, and it's only the last one that counts. So, that should be the case is that, if somebody just changes their mind, because somebody says something that isn't agreeing with them, that should be possible. You shouldn't, if people are voting, weeks in advance and then they change their mind, it should be allowed to change people's minds. But it should only, the last time that they register and sign or whatever their vote over should be the one that counts. So you need to be able to make sure that you have a solid identity system. And I think that's one of the core issues is that, and that's why one of the things that, Mike, you've been mentioning as well, is the different swing states. Is that's one of the key areas, looking back. And that's why the registration databases become targets, is because if you can target the voter registration databases and what those swing states are going to be, you can then make sure that you target the right areas. And I think when I step back and I look at it is very complex and, different states take their own methods and own ways of how to do it. But I think that's actually also one of the benefits is actually the voting system in the US is decentralized, which is a good thing. I see that as a positive because having it decentralized makes a targeted attacker more difficult because they would have to change the vote in many locations and do it physically in many locations in order to really do it that way. But I think to your point, Mike, is that if you're able to get information in the registration databases and who's going to vote what way, then you only need to target that's very, very few counties that will swing a state's outcome.
Yep. Yeah, the decentralization is nice in that regard, right? You think about it as like that's the benefit, but in reality, I don't think it's as. But yeah.
So Dan, I have a question for you. You mentioned there's a lot of investment in the security of the elections and voting system itself. Is the investment going into specific areas, or is it actually getting an equal across? Because one thing that I see is that in disinformation in social media, I think it's the companies in social media who've taken the initiative there to try and do something about it. But I don't see any initiatives around securing that or labeling it from a government perspective. And then also we've got the voter registration, and then you've got the campaigns, which then typically have unskilled people who's brought in temporarily in order to run the campaigns and secure the campaigns. I think it was awesome to see one of your colleagues, was it getting hired as a CISO for, I think it was at the DMC, for actually putting people in charge of security in those areas. And then also, and then there's the infrastructure itself. Are they being secured equally, or is there kind of one that's been preferred over the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you probably get different opinions on that from different people. Clearly, the areas that have been getting, I think, the most money have been the machines themselves. Making sure you had paper backup, you can validate things. That was kind of identified pretty quickly. From kind of 2016 to 2018. I think there have been, a number of efforts that are done at the federal level, looking overall at, we start talking about things like hacking and foreign influence and intelligence around, what are they trying to do? How are they trying to do it? There's some great testimony. I mean, literally you can listen to hours and hours of testimony. Just, Google, or my blog listed a lot of them as well. But you can go and you can listen to congressional testimony from different groups, different secretaries of states around the country, on on all the different threats from different countries, not just Russia, China, other places. Money has gone to, so some of it's been kind of an umbrella overarching kind of a thing across the nation, because nobody wants, foreign governments to be, whether you talk about any kind of traditional, techniques to do a cyber attack, whether that be DDoS, as you mentioned, Joseph, or whether that be, whatever. There's a whole, hacking the database themselves, a lot of attention on the databases, a lot of attention, certainly a lot of attempts, noted attempts. This has been on CNN, Fox News, all of it, examples of where foreign governments have tried to influence, and then a big push around the whole social media thing. Are you getting your news from Facebook? Are you getting it from, whatever sources, and trying to influence Twitter, trying to influence. So I'd say money has gone to all those things. I would say, has it been equal? There's always states, I'll tell you, that want more money. So I've never known a security officer to say, no, I've got plenty of money. I'm good. Just keep the money in Washington. State governments by default are going to ask for that. They're going to have their hands out. And like I said, the pixie dust has been election security. I think it will be probably well after this election. And this is going to be an ongoing topic, guys. I would not be surprised if we're back here in 4 years talking about election security. Even possibly 2 years. Because
I'm curious what the process is. Sorry, go on. I'm sorry, Dan.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, no, I was just curious. So you were talking about everything leading up to the vote, but what about the security? Where's the money going and process and stuff post? I've cast my vote, and then there's all of the counting and auditing and all of that. We talked about the registration, we talked about the voting, but what's happening on the other side of that? Because I feel like that's another area that I just don't have any insight into.
Yeah, so there's money being spent, and I can, again, I'm not going to name states, but I know particularly, I've been on calls in the last couple months, couple weeks actually, where they're looking at, okay, how do you get? So let's just say you get an absentee ballot. Even how can I get that in? Can I email that in? Can I take a picture of it with my cell phone and send it in? I kid you not. In some states that's allowed. Can I, do I have to, how do I know that's for me? How do I know that's not from Joseph? How do I know, how do you know, is anybody looking? So that back office process, there is money being applied to that and making sure that's a secure process. And I think you said, what do I worry the most about right now? There is money being spent on that process. They are looking end to end. They are looking at the back office. They are looking at election night. They are, down to that individual precinct. I think there's a lot of fear around, okay, will they have enough volunteers because of COVID? Mm-hmm. Will people literally come in? A lot of the people around the country, this is really talking non-tech. This is about as low tech as you can get. A lot of the people tend to be more elderly. A lot of the people, they volunteer. They feel like it's their civic duty. So you go in America to many parts of the United States, certainly in Michigan here, you have a lot of, and God bless them, they're great people. They're, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they're in there kind of running the whole system. And it's the same people been doing it for years. And will they even be there on election day? Because of the rate of COVID, being there with masks on and all the rest. So at a very basic level, is it going to be, back to the people piece, who physically is going to be there? Mm-hmm. But a lot of money being spent on that. I think that process, my fear is it's changing in a number of states right now. And will they get this ironed out prior to COVID? Was a big wrinkle in a lot of election security plans. Right. It was not part of the playbook. It was not part of the exercise. I was a part of election security tabletops in 2019. Mm-hmm. And COVID was not part of the strategy.
A pandemic happening in an election year was not one of those.
Wasn't in the resiliency plan. I'm pretty sure. So Dan, I've got a question, because one thing that we haven't really talked about, at least in this year, and what played a big role in 2016 was Cambridge Analytica. And one thing that I've been very adamant about is that, and it's going back to campaigns, is when campaigns are using data sources, which could be considered, Cambridge Analytica data source, in many regarded as a basically an artificial intelligence type of weapon, in order that can be used in order to see about what things you need to do, and getting that, let's say not through consent and not understanding about what that data was being collected and being used for. So, and it hasn't been really kind of discussed this year. I haven't heard much, discussions around. Do you think that campaigns should be allowed to use data sources such as that? And if they do, should it be transparent to the citizen about, the data sources that they're using it for? I think for me, that concerns me is really where they're making the decisions and where they're getting the data sources in order to spend the money on the campaigns, but the transparency is never there.
Great point, Joseph. I'm not going to. I'm going to be transparent with you. I'm not going to answer the first part of your question. I will tell you that it's happening.
I think it's a moot point because of super PACs and other ways that campaigns can. You don't need the campaign can be as transparent as you want. They have all these other people that don't fall under those same laws that are able to do all of the same things, but unofficially. So I think it's sort of it almost doesn't even matter what we think with regard to campaigns.
Correct. Yeah. And that's exactly right, Mike. I agree. The cat's out of the bag. The train's already left the station. The water's already over the waterfall. I mean, it's happening, guys.
Right.
And Dan Lohrmann think it's right or not, or, we're going to get into campaign finance and all the rest of it. I mean, people are getting the data. They're getting data in lots of ways. Analytics is huge. It's probably bigger this year than it was in 2016. In my experience, both campaigns are using, any way and every way they can possibly get data. They're using the data. Right. And they're targeting it. They're going to target to get the vote out. They're going to use it to, you name it, slice it, dice it. We all know the power of data and the analytics behind that. And I think, just like the same thing with Facebook, we've had all these hearings. We could go in, it's a whole other spin on another show, but what's happening with all the big, Facebook and privacy and all of that, all the global Google and what's happening with the big tech companies. Will things really change? I mean, will there be more regulation? Some people say yes, some people say no. Well, I don't think they're going to get broken up. I don't see it. It could happen, but we discuss it, we talk about it, and then we move on to the next election. It doesn't seem like much has changed.
I look forward to when they have enough analytics and data that I don't even need to cast a vote, right? They've used AI to figure out how I'm going to vote. So
there was a movie about that called The Circle, wasn't there?
that brain reading technology would just, it's just going to automatically go in there and grab your vote out of your brain.
Right, they don't even have to read my brain; they just read my Facebook.
Next time you travel and you walk through one of those airport scanners, it will actually, cast your vote for you.
There you go.
Well, AI's heading there, guys. That's, make sure it's not a robot that's voting for you. We got to do that. We got to do that identity theft protection thing, Joseph. I think your point about what you guys do in Estonia, what people do. I'm a big admirer of what you guys do. You and I have talked about this. I think what you guys do is amazing. I think it's really a global model. It's not where we're at in America, the verification, one person, one vote, there's all kinds of jokes around this, vote, early and often and all the rest of it. I don't think fraud is as bad as the Republicans say it is, but I don't think it's as good as the Democrats think it is. I think it's somewhere in between. And I think that this is going to be a really, really interesting year. Because the wrench that was thrown in the engine is the pandemic.
Well, I think what's also interesting, and again, back to the sort of what happens after, I think it's a really good example of security that I deal with on a regular basis, which is where that push and pull of a secure process and a fast process, right? You said it earlier. You don't want a process where it's going to take us months to figure out who actually won the election. You need to know you have some votes that are coming in immediately, so you're going to start seeing those results. And then if people start counting votes manually through the mail or through whatever, and it starts to swing the other way, then there's going to be all kinds of questions of was there fraud? Wasn't there? So you need this efficient process. And that's such a push and pull that's so typical between security and sort of the business side of the business, whatever, we need this done. And that push and pull and making and that's what worries me is that speed and the sort of the business side is going to drive a lot of decisions where maybe security or that will have to make compromises, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, this is one of the things in Estonia that Estonia focused on. The whole thing here, it actually started off, post-Soviet era, back in 1991. The whole reason why Estonia went down this path of digital identity and electronic voting was back during Soviet era, was that their history was changed so many times. It was the history kept getting changed. And going back to the whole purpose why you have paper ballots is integrity and auditability and non-repudiation of the vote itself. And ultimately, Estonia realized, and they went down a paperless society, which turned into a digital society, which turned into the government being a service provider. And ultimately to the point where that we got to really having a very efficient digital identity online, where I can go to get online prescriptions, I can vote, I can go to a vending machine, I can park my car. There's many things. I can do my tax in 2 clicks, literally within less than 3 minutes. It just depends on how fast your computer is and internet connection.
But that's also because you trust your government. I mean, there's the problem in the U.S. is that digital identity is definitely going to be controversial here.
And it goes back to, it's not about, it's the way that the government took it is that they didn't take it as a backdoor that the government can actually see everything you're doing. They actually made it as a front door, meaning that the government is also transparent to the citizen about everything that the government has access to and sees. Mm-hmm. So if you actually make it that it's a reversal situation, because it builds, it's a two-way trust. And that's the only way to build it, is that trust is bi-directional. It's not one direction. And for the citizens to trust the government has to be transparent to the citizen and vice versa. You have to have that ability in order to create that. And during the pandemic in Estonia, people were able to still do online shopping, online schooling, and also vote online, all in the safety of their home. So that was one of the things. And it got to the point where even the innovations, even in a post-2000, it's not perfect. There is security flaws, but it's about being transparent in the security flaws. It's about knowing the risks and doing things to reduce those. And some of the implementations was around using blockchain for the non-repudiation of the digital data. So therefore, government can't manipulate the results themselves directly.
I think Estonia is going to be the model. I mean, we've got to head there. Yeah. We've got to get there. I don't know if we're going to be there in 4 years, but we're certainly not there this year. And I do agree with you, Joseph, that the challenge is going to be the process this year. How do we know, again, back to, I'm kind of hoping it's not a really close vote. I mean, some states it may not make any difference. I mean, counting late ballots or whatever in California probably isn't going to make a whole lot of difference. But in some states, obviously the swing states, the 6 or 7, one of them is Michigan here that I live in.
Right.
It's going to be really key. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see. And I just hope we don't have, guys, but I fear we might. I hope we don't have that kind of that hanging Chad moment of 2000 of, and everyone's, there's pictures of the guy looking at the Chads and what happened in Florida with, Bush beating Gore. It won't be the hanging Chads this time. It will be like, was it, Joseph, you mentioned, was it his vote in person? Was it the mail-in ballot? And how do we know it wasn't counted twice? And again, I think there are processes in place. I don't want to instill fear in the audience. I think there are processes that can do this. The question is, how do we know they're going to be followed, and how do we verify those things, especially where the changes have been made in the last 90 to 120 days during the pandemic?
And how well are they being communicated? Because Joe brought up a great point, which was, if I do vote twice, if I vote in person and I vote by mail and whatever, I don't actually know in Maryland which of those, I mean, I'm sure I can look it up. I just don't know which of those would actually count. And I don't know where I'm sure if I Google it hard enough, I'll probably find it, but I don't know that that's being communicated effectively either.
When you think about that process too, it's like, what if you voted for a different person?
I mean, well, right, exactly. What if they don't line up?
Throw them both out. Does your vote not count at all? I mean, in some states, I mean, that's why I kind of go back to that hanging Chad story. It's funny to go back and read those stories. It's like, under this condition, we're gonna count it as a Gore vote. Under this condition, it's a George W. vote. And then if it's this condition, it's a wasted ballot. It's a spent ballot. So nobody gets the vote. So I mean, in the case of, could it even be the process? Again, different states may have different processes, but what if you vote 3 times for the same person? Do you throw out all 3 votes? Does none of the votes count? Because you're not, the law says, you can do one or the other, and you're not supposed to do both. So, I mean, again, the challenge is, I hope we don't get down to that close of a vote. That's my big fear. Mm-hmm.
I also hope that the sort of that collision process doesn't invalidate votes, right? If it's that easy for me to, if somebody votes and it's all I have to do is send in another sort of contradictory ballot to invalidate their ballot, their vote, that's also problematic. I mean, that's that, so hopefully there's some really solid rules to make sure that the vote, I don't know, how do you verify that I voted for this and that which one of those is going to count?
That's I think the Republican fear. How do we know that somebody didn't make 10 copies and mail in 10 different things, or somebody, your guy across the street got your mail, or somehow voted for you? I mean, how do we know it was you? I mean, this
is the transparency piece. This is going back to the transparency, is that how does every citizen in the U.S. know that their vote counted? Right. That it actually went to the final vote. And if they made a mistake, how do they know, what can they do in the future to rectify it? It's that transparency with the citizens. And that's what I'm saying. It's always a two-way trust. It's always bi-directional. You have to know what you did was correct, so you don't repeat the same mistake. And maybe people didn't know that they were doing something incorrectly, and they just repeat the same mistake, and therefore they continually, over multiple votes over years, are voting incorrectly, and it never gets counted.
Right, but I think that's such a cultural thing. I mean, the U.S. is founded on question your government, question it. So that trust is. I think it's actually a really hard problem to solve, in the sense that we don't have a lot of trust in our government officials and in our governments in general. There is a lot of skepticism about what they do with our data and how they handle our data. I mean, I know things that I don't want to take this conversation in a totally different direction, but you know what I mean? And so I think the idea of a national ID, that's very, very controversial. National, or even a statewide, digital ID is going to be just a really sticky wicket.
So I did a calculation, and I took the same model that Estonia had, and I actually applied it. It doesn't have to be the same model. It just has to look at how do you stop people from wasting their time, which is ultimately the process of the voting. You have a process that wastes a lot of people's time. And in Estonia, it was that they were saving up to 6 to 7 days per year of GDP of the country by having this process in place. And if you actually applied that model to the US, even just getting it close to it, the US would save $1 trillion per year in wasted, stopping people from wasting their time.
If we all use public transit instead of clogging up the Beltway, the same logic applies. But yet, there's a cultural thing of that's just, it doesn't translate.
Yeah. Well, especially during a pandemic, when people don't want to transport.
Well, there's that too.
You come up with a great process, and then along comes the pandemic. I mean, I think I really do think we were on track for a much better result this time. I do think the pandemic. I really mean that. I'm an optimist. I'm actually, I'm a government bureaucrat. Sorry, no, but I actually think we had a really good thing going. We were ready to rock and roll. But I think people were more aware that people trying to influence in them. Just being aware that, hey, Russia's trying to influence your vote. China's trying to influence your vote. Your Facebook. I mean, people were more aware. People saw what happened last time. They're not going to be, maybe, like I said, not as trusting that message is really from my friend, or, whatever. I think a lot of those things were corrected. I think the challenge is going to be, again, how do we know, and by the way, the other piece we have, you didn't mention, Mike, I just want to say real quick.
Listen.
In the U.S., we have more lawyers than anywhere in the world.
Well, yeah. No, don't get you right. Exactly. Tort reform is a huge issue.
They don't have their people there. I mean, it was just always so funny. I picture the guy back to 2000. I'm thinking, as they're casting these, you got a Republican lawyer, a Democratic lawyer at the counter. You got 6 people all looking at this card with the microscope and with the magnifying glass, and there's some really funny pictures from Florida in 2000.
Right.
So I mean, you're going to have a lot of lawyers. You're going to have, there's going to be processes in watching it. And again, I think that's the thing that's keeping me up at night, even more than hacking of voter files. or hacking of machines. That's personally for Dan Lohrmann.
I think absolutely, Dan. There's a lot has improved over the last 4 years. Absolutely, from one thing, as I do say, the social media companies, starting to flag political or even prevent political statements on those platforms. I think that was one step forward. So people get a bit more of context, because the biggest problem we lose in internet is context. Is where was the original source of things that came into my? Did it really come from my friend? Those trends. So I think that's one great thing, and I think. Also, the reports that came out from the agencies in the US about what happened in 2016 as well, and prior to that, being transparent. And I think even starting to see, I think that even started a trend. Even now we're seeing a lot more reports getting revealed about not just election hacking attempts, but also other types of things like ransomware and malware that's also attempted, that it's now got the agencies more willing to be more careful and more, really revealing those public reports. And that's a great step forward as well. So we're not getting people having visibility, and then also investment in the states and actually improving the machines themselves, and also protecting the databases. So, out of all those things, what's the fear that you have in the upcoming elections? Is it the COVID scenario that the resource issue? Is there any type of hacking thing that would be the one that we should be aware about? Which is the one that you would kind of indicate is the problem? Or the confidence side? It's just the disinformation of the confidence in the outcome as well. But it does become very close.
Yeah, I think it's the timing. I think people in America, people want to hear on election night. They want to hear the concession speech, and they want to see the president by midnight, whoever wins. A lot of people are predicting again. I don't know that I want to make a prediction here, but it literally, if it's really close, could come down to days, and it won't be. It may not be by you wake up in the morning, you go to bed at midnight, you wake up in the morning, you may not know who the next president. I mean, I think that scenario of that's what the stock market doesn't like. The stock market doesn't like unknowns. It doesn't like to know indecision. I think if it comes down to a handful of states and it's really close, you're going to see a lot more scrutiny around these processes we're talking about, and what changed in the last, since April 1st. And I think, and maybe even hopefully it becomes clear who the winner is, and hopefully maybe we'll dodge this bullet. I really pray that we do. But I just if we get down to that level of hanging chads, that's where I think it's going to get ugly, because then it's going to be like, well, how was this decided, and who said that it's, back to your scenarios, Mike, who said that if I sent in two ballots, and, if we change the rules, does that change the winner? If we change the rules, like I changed my mind and I voted the day of, and so I flopped my vote. Do we count that vote, or does it wash because I voted for the other candidate 3 days earlier when I mailed in my ballot? I mean, if somebody then says if you change that decision that was made in April or whatever, and that changes the result, I mean, you get that now we're talking really close, right?
Yeah,
that's my biggest fear, Joseph.
I think we should maybe wrap it up on something, but maybe something on the positive side, maybe rather than fears and whatever. I mean, I think we already touched on a fair bit of all the benefits all the things that have happened recently and all the strides we've made. I don't know, Dan, if you had any final thoughts on that before we go on.
I mean, guys, listen, I do think that we have a lot of very good, capable, competent people that are looking at this both at a state-by-state level. I'm a believer in state government technology. I
hope so.
In 17 years, I don't think you can be in cybersecurity without being an optimist that good's going to triumph over evil. I really believe that. I really believe that, guys. And I think you got the FBI, you got all the intelligence agencies helping out. I think we can do this. We can do it successfully, and we can have a really good election result. The harder it gets is the closer it gets. And I think what happened in 2000 doesn't have to be. I'm not pretending that it's going to be the same. I actually am optimistic that we won't have that situation. I hope we don't. But that was a very, very close election that came down to one state, and it's never really happened anything like that in our history. But So yeah, I feel like a lot of good progress has been made, and I think that people should become educated. If you're really interested in this, if you're nervous about this, read up. Contact your local people, and whether you're I say congressman, call your congressman. No, but I'd say definitely there's a lot of really good projects happening, and I think we can be encouraged about that.
I completely agree, Dan. And I think my summary from the discussion is that a lot of positives have been made, a lot of improvements in transparency. And I think for my key takeaway here for the audience is that I think it's really important is to participate. If you are interested in it, vote. Don't let it go to waste. And if you are concerned about what is the right way, I think that's the important part. Is the state should make sure it's transparent into what the options are and what actually becomes a valid vote. How to vote correctly, I think, is the transparency. So you don't get into a situation where invalidate your own vote by voting incorrectly or multiple times. So I think the key takeaways here is definitely participate, get out and vote. And do it safely as well. The pandemic is at the heights and still has a swing again. Do it in a way that focuses on your health. Take that as a priority as well. But Dan, your insights, and it's very educational for me as well, because I do kind of look at it and do the comparison between Estonia and the US all the time. But I understand it's a complex system, and I understand that there is very differences, and sometimes even Estonia may not be able to fit perfectly or into that model. But I think that it's positives have been made, but my thing, I think, still what needs to be made more is that transparency, in how it works to the citizens, so they know how to do it correctly. So,
right, and I think that goes into my key takeaway is more around the get involved. It's vote, but also get involved. Understand how the election system in your state works. That's where you have the opportunity to potentially influence. It's at the state level. You're voting for the people who are making those rules and deciding those rules. Make sure that they have a good sense of how to handle it. I think that's really my key takeaway, is really how to get involved and make sure that you are getting involved. So yeah. Absolutely.
So awesome. Many thanks, Dan. It's awesome having you on the show. Yep. And I'm really looking forward to having more. I think it's been way too long since we've chatted. So,
absolutely. I want to interview you for my blog as well.
We did.
Talk about how you guys do it so well, elections so well in Estonia.
Yeah. So I think for my summary is, for the audience, priority is your safety is the number one thing. Your health and safety is the priority, but do participate. The voting does have an impact on your future and your lives and kids and everything out there. So it's important to participate. Hopefully this has been educational and, it's giving you some insights into what we fear, the worries that we have, but also the positives that's been made. So, please do get involved, follow Dan. His blogs are awesome. I really enjoy reading them all the time. And he's a great insight and mentor and educator in awareness and security in general. So it's awesome having Dan on the show. Stay safe out there. Make sure, these podcasts come out every 2 weeks. So, do come in, subscribe, listen, follow us. We always, enjoy to help educate, share the knowledge, and have a fun time at the same time. So again, Dan, thanks for having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.